Well, you knew it. You really knew it. But then the teacher gave you a test over material that you were sure that you had never seen before in your life. Did you ever have a teacher like that? It can be very frustrating. These kind of teachers seem determined not to pour information into your head, but somehow to change you and change your ways of thinking, to change your ways of living. Once you answers to yesterday's questions, they change the questions. And when you've learned the new questions, they rearrange the entire course. Well, one of the wonderful things about going to a non-denominational seminary is that you are surrounded by people with all sorts of interesting stories. This one comes from a Southern Baptist doctoral student who did his master's degree at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary before attending Union Theological Seminary in New York. He had a famous teacher named Dale Moody, who is of the family of the Moody Bible Institute fame. Well, as the story goes, Professor Moody would come in at least once a semester into his class and cry, "All right, class, tear up your notes, throw them out. I don't believe that stuff anymore." Well, he was being humorous just a little bit, but he would also say, "We're going in a different direction." When he was done, the teaching assistant would take pity on the folks in the class and would say, "All right, let's try to make something out of this, okay?" But in the Gospels, the disciples don't have a teaching assistant to come in and try to help them make sense of things. Instead, the disciples are stuck with the most life-changingly frustrating teacher of all times, Jesus. You see, Jesus doesn't ever seem to want to give answers to the questions that his disciples ask. His disciples are constantly asking him questions like, "Are you really the Messiah, Jesus? How many times do I have to forgive other people? Can I have a place of honor in your kingdom?" And rarely, if ever, does Jesus answer these questions directly. Jesus redirects, or he answers a question with a question in return, or sometimes he simply tells the disciples, "You don't have a clue of what you're asking." You see, Jesus didn't come to just make a nip here and a tuck there with the powers that be. Jesus didn't come to share God's 10 days to a totally new you plan, as if somehow you and I could make our way into the kingdom without radical change. Now, Jesus was no mere reformer. He was a revolutionary. Jesus came and taught in ways to confuse and confound all the people who followed him. He didn't give out easy answers and life coaching plans. Instead, Jesus came to rip the rug out from underneath the world as we know it, the worldly wisdom as we know it. Jesus came to overturn community and religious and economic and political and ethical assumptions of respectable folks like you and me and his disciples. Jesus wanted to confuse and confound his followers. He wanted to shake them and us up. He wanted them and us to even question our grip on reality of life as we know it, so that he can bring them and us into the kingdom of God, and we can embrace life as it ought to be, life as it really is. Well, today, you and I and Christians all over the world celebrate the Transfiguration of the Lord. It's the day that the church remembers when Jesus went up on Mount Tabor with his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, and Jesus was changed. Change is the clarion call for this day, with light and pyrotechnics befitting the best Hollywood epic movie. Jesus' face is changed and starts to glow brighter than the sun, brighter than the heart light at the end of E.T., the extraterrestrial's finger. Jesus' face becomes radiant. And his clothes undergo a Cloroxing too. Jesus' clothes change and they become brighter than John Travolta's polyester leisure suit in Saturday Night Fever. Jesus shows Peter, James, and John who he really is. Jesus is God's beloved Son. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law as shown by Moses, who appears at his side. Jesus is the seal of the prophets who are embodied in Elijah, who appears on his other side. And so as not to be outdone, the voice of the Father booms over it all, saying, "This is my Son, my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Jesus is the one who is full of glory. Jesus is the one who is God. Jesus is the one who came to change the world, changed from glory into glory. Changed by Christ, we see clearer than we've ever seen before. But the key to understanding the Transfiguration and the change that Jesus is ushering in and the utter confusion of the disciples is found just a few verses preceding the Transfiguration. Back at the tail end of chapter 16, the Bible says, "From that time forward, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and raised again on the third day." And Peter took Jesus aside and said, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." You see, Peter, James, and John, the crowds that gathered in villages and towns all over Galilee and Judah, came because they expected that Jesus was the long-awaited king of David's lineage, the anointed one, the Messiah. And the Messiah that they were expecting was a Messiah of one who would raise an army and throw out the Romans and their puppet king. The Messiah that they were expecting was a Messiah who would swoop in and save the day and change everything so that Israel could again shine and be a light to the nations. Their questions were, who's going to save us from the Romans? Who's going to save us from this humiliation? Who's going to save us from our poverty and oppression? And then Jesus administers the test question. Jesus says, "Who do folks say that I am?" Well, some said, "Oh, one of the prophets." But Peter, that precocious disciple with the right answer, says, "Jesus, you are the Messiah, the one that we've been waiting for. You're the one who's going to save God's people." And Jesus responded and said, "You are exactly right, Peter, except that everything's going to be turned upside down. Yes, I am the Messiah." But from that time forward, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the chief priests and scribes, not be crowned, and be killed, not enthroned, and raised again the third day. I don't even want to know what you're talking about. And to all of this, Peter says, "No way, Jesus, you're wrong. That's not what I've been taught to expect." And to that answer, Jesus says to his precocious student, "You're looking at everything like the devil. Go back to the end of the class." You see, Peter, everything is different than you thought. The Messiah has come, but not to fulfill your dreams and your schemes and the world's ways. The Messiah has come to suffer and be killed and be raised on the third day to save you. And for the bonus, anyone who is to be my disciple must follow me, must take up their cross and walk with me on this path. Well, brothers and sisters, that was depressing. For people who had put their hopes and dreams in Jesus for 3 years and had been following him, this was unthinkable. I'm going to Jerusalem to die? Imagine a politician today, someone who's been running for president for 3 years, who's gathered followers and crowds around him. This one, and then says to the followers and his closest disciples, "I'm going to be assassinated and on the third day rise again from the dead." What are you talking about? No, that's not how we've got it all figured out. So 6 days later, Jesus has a special study session for Peter, James, and John. He takes them up on top of Mount Tabor. Mountaintops, you know, are important in the Bible. Mountaintops are where we heard that Moses got the 10 Commandments. Mountaintop is where Elijah bested the prophets of Baal. And behold, on the mountaintop with the disciples, Jesus is no longer the crucified suffering servant. He's transfigured. The glory of God shines through him for all to see. He is the glory of God incarnate, blinding white light, dazzling special effects. The heavens open up and the voice of God booms. And then you can imagine Peter's voice through it all. Yes, Jesus, this is exactly what I was talking about. This is more like it. You see, Jesus, I was right all along. Now we've got it going here. Power, glory, might, a little divine mojo. I don't know what you were talking about those 6 days ago. This is the real thing. This is the real you. This is real faith. So let's just stop everything right here. Okay? Let me build some tents, Jesus, and we'll just stay here and enjoy. Well, many followers of Christ, good guys like Peter, want to stay right there on the mountain of glory. And Jesus isn't going to let that happen. As you may know, Martin Luther said there are two basic approaches to the Christian life. One is a theology of glory, and it means that you and I get heaven on earth right here and right now. Jesus swoops in and blesses us and gives us a lifetime of sunny days and success and love and peace and joy and health and endless happiness, and nothing but nothing is ever going to bring us down. The other way is to have the theology of the cross. The way of the cross now and the glory of God beyond. And how are these two responses to Christ playing? Well, the theologians of glory are everywhere. They're burning up the airwaves. They're building 10,000-member megachurches with multi-million-dollar campuses. They're writing books that tell you and me how to get the best that God intends for us now. They're trying to convince us that all we have to do is pray and it will pay with cars and houses and success and accolades and happiness and a McMansion in the suburbs where everybody looks like us and talks like us and dresses like us and thinks like us. And we can just stay right here like we already are and not really change anything much about our lives or our values or our dreams. But you already know the problem with this scenario. The problem is Jesus. Jesus walks in, and Jesus is the most provocative person I know. Jesus walks in and overturns our tables. He changes everything that we believe, and He won't stop until we're like Him. Jesus is relentless. If you and I have tamed Jesus, it's our fault because Jesus won't be tamed. Here's a version of a mountaintop religion that got my attention this week. It comes from Mark Laberton, pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Berkeley, California. He shares that at a worship service he attended, the leader began with prayer. He asked God to meet them and to draw them into God's presence. And then the band started playing, and the worship leader started lifting his hands and offering his praises to God. But that's when Mark really started to notice. When the worship leader lifted his hands to God, he rose up on the tips of his toes. And when he brought his arms down, he brought his heels back down. Only not onto the floor, but onto the toes of the praise band who was sitting behind him. And this tromping in the spirit kept up. This guy was totally oblivious to his neighbors behind him. He was so caught up in what he was doing that he couldn't be bothered with anything or anyone else. Well, I have no doubt that the worship leader was so caught up in his God moment that he simply lost track of others. And that, dear friend, is exactly the problem. For all our apparent passion about God, in our worship of God, you and I often presume that we can follow God, enjoy God in a way that lets us forget the world around us. Let's stay here on the mountain. But this was the very pattern of faith that brought God's judgment on God's people in the Bible. You can't divorce love of God from love of neighbor. Peter said, "This is it. I'm feeling good. Everything's glorious. Whatever you were talking about those few days ago, let's forget about it." But friends, this is not the good news that Jesus came to bring. Jesus didn't come to bring a message for us, for the church. Jesus didn't come to bless those who would follow Him. He didn't come to save sometimes faithful churchgoers from our tight spots and our bad judgment calls. Nor did Jesus come to establish a religion that was caught up in loving God, so caught up in loving God that you and I could forget about stepping on the toes of our neighbors in the praise band.